Well, thank you, Ralph. I didn't expect all those good words. And I didn't pay him to say that either. But anyway, it's an honor to have, and it's great to have Ralph and his wife and 4 children up visiting us for a week or so. And we have another son in California. Also, they're actually on their way up here. And they have 6 grandchildren that they're going to bring to us to visit with. So we'll be busy after this lecture is over here. So anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to present this topic. Last month, you'll recall, we had a video showing how students react to what they're being taught in the classroom. They're being told that evolution is a fact. And look at all the scientists that believe that evolution is true. You know, it must be true. It must be a fact, as Dawkins says. And so with my science background, I've investigated some of their claims. And that book I mentioned has 77 false ideas about science supporting the theory of evolution. And I pick what I regard as the 4 top scientific reasons that are used to argue for the truth of science behind evolution. And I'm going to show you there's no good science behind it. And so that's the gist of what I'm going to be talking about. So to make sure we're all talking about the same thing, we have to make sure that we're using the same definitions. And so I'm going to talk about what do we mean by evolution? What do we mean by science? And then when we look at evidence, scientific evidence, we all see the same evidence. Why do we come to different conclusions? And I'll explain that as well. And then we'll look at the 4 fatal flaws in evolution. Okay, first of all, what do we mean by evolution? Unfortunately, when the evolutionists talk, and people like Dr. Richard Dawkins talk, they say, well, look, you can see this happening, for example, microevolution. Therefore, macroevolution must also be true. And we'll see that they can't offer any concrete scientific evidence, but they give you a definition, and then they look at something else with a different definition. Or they give you a straw man proposal and knock that down. So when you hear the word evolution, don't think of artificial selection. Yeah, that works. You know, scientists have doing artificial selection throughout the ages, and they can get a cow to produce more milk, but there's a limit. Okay, it doesn't turn into a different species, it's still a cow. And yes, you can change it somewhat, but there's a limit. And some people use the word very loosely, you know, changing design of a car, or changing coastline, or something else changing. Again, that's not what we mean. And then you come to microevolution, which is small variations within prescribed limits of complexity. You know, there's dog kinds, for example. And yeah, there are different kinds of dogs, different species, but they're all related. And there are variations within limits of complexity. Finch beaks have been used as evidence for evolution. And we all agree as scientists that, yes, they're good examples of microevolution. There's changes within certain limits in those, but they don't change from one species into another totally different species. And then we come to the word macroevolution, and this is the one that we focus on. You'll see that it's never been observed. It can't be observed. And what do we mean by macroevolution? Well, you've heard some of them. Particles to people. You know, dead material, and then all of a sudden something comes alive, a living cell, and eventually evolves into a human being. Does that happen? Have you ever seen that happen? No. And then we have at the very beginning, molecular evolution, origin of life. How did life start from non-living material? Do we have any evidence that that's possible? Do we have any evidence that it happened? Do we have any evidence that it could happen if we just had the right starting material? And so, in summary, you know, 1, 2, and 3 have been observed. We all agree on that. Number 4 has never been observed, and number 5, for example, is impossible, can be shown to be mathematically impossible to happen. And I'm not going to go through what we mean by evolution, but so when I use the word evolution, that's what I mean, macroevolution, really Darwinian evolution. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about microevolution. So the story of evolution, just follow the arrows, and you can see what they mean by that. But the evolution claims in the middle of the chart, all organisms are related through common ancestry. In other words, life started with one living cell and then just branched out, and all the living materials, see plants and animals, can all be explained as coming from that first cell. That's what they believe. All organisms arose through the process of mutation, natural selection. That is Darwin's contribution to the theory. And they persist through random processes of nature. And that's what Darwin says. And that's what we take as the definition of evolution. Okay, then we come to science. Science is the search for truth. And you all know from school that you can come up with a theory that explains something, or a hypothesis that explains something. And you can run experiments against that hypothesis and show whether it's true or not. And if it's, well, it looks like it might almost be true, you can change some of your postulates and make observations, and yep, it looks like it might be true. And then you can have your fellow colleagues try the same experiments to see if they get the same results. And if you all get the same results, well, then it's very likely true. But this requires repeatable experiments over and over again. And so you can show whether a scientific theory is likely to be true or not. But then you come to origins. I mean, what do you do about origins? You know, we got here either through creation, as the Bible says, or we got here through evolution. Can you run experiments on that? No, you can't. You can't go back in history and rerun creation. You can't go back and create the first living cell if that's how we got here. So we weren't there, but you can compare it with solving a crime. For example, how do you solve a murder if nobody observed that crime happening? You look for forensic evidence. For beginnings, you can also look for forensic evidence. And so you see, how does the evidence fit the theory or the concept or the model of creation, or does it better support the model of evolution? And so you can draw some conclusions from that and come to a likely answer for that. And this diagram probably summarizes that best. Science, it happens in the present. It is the experiments are repeatable and observable, and you can check me out and run the same experiment, see if you get the same result. That's science. History, again, it happened in the past. It's not, the events are not repeatable, but there was an eyewitness account. Somebody wrote about that event, and therefore you can, you know, if you trust the writer, and if it happened very recently, you know, you can probably come to the conclusion that, yep, that really did happen. But then you have, if you go to some event in the past and it's not repeatable, like creation or evolution, and there's no human evidence, no human witness to see that happen, that's a belief system. You have to believe that's true. And so how do you, quote, prove it's true or determine that it's likely true? Well, you have to look at the evidence. That's all you can do. So when we look at evidence, we have to be able to explain it. And there's only 3 ways to explain every piece of evidence. Either something happened by chance, something happened because it had to be true because there's a law of nature which will make it always be true. You know, if I step off this podium here, put my foot over, am I going up? Or am I going down? I'm always going down because the law of gravity says I'll always go down. By chance, there's stuff in the ceiling here, and let's say it falls down in a certain way, and that's the explanation for that chair in the front row. Believe that? No. So if that chair didn't happen by chance or by a law of nature, how did it get here? Somebody designed that chair, and then another craftsman built that chair. There's only three explanations for everything we see. And so we have to answer the question, the evidence that I see, how do I explain that? One of these three ways, and that's it. Okay? So with that, I'm going to run into these four fatal flaws in the theory of evolution. First of all, macroevolution has never been observed. Okay? So what is macroevolution? Well, that's your particles to people, molecules to man, common descent. And if it really starts out with molecules, there must have come about some advanced features via mutations and natural selection. Okay? Because we are very complex animals. You know, the DNA in our bodies is very complex. If you look at a cell, it's very complex. Where did the information come from to build, you know, a human being from that first cell? So things go from simple to complex living organisms. That's Darwinian evolution. His theory is dependent on that. The goo to you evolution. Somebody would say the goo to you through the zoo. You know, do you have any evidence that that can happen? Well, no, because there's no way you can add information to the first living cell if that's what started this whole thing. So macroevolution, going from the first simple cell to something more complex, has never been observed. And you know, a lot of conjectures have been made, but it's never been observed. So microevolution, on the other hand, is observed. And what do we mean by microevolution? It's probably, first of all, it's a bad name to use. It's better called adaptation to your environment. You know, the living organism is adapting to its environment. And so the organism is actually programmed so it can modify based on the environment that it's in. It can't add new information, but it can adapt to its environment. And some examples that we use for that, Darwin's finches. When you've heard that there's 13 species of finches on the Galapagos Islands, and well, they're all finches, and the story goes that, well, the finches, if there's a long drought, the finches with the longest beak will be able to survive longer because they can dig deeper for their food. Okay, and so they've measured those changes and said, well, if this goes on for a number of generations, then look the finches are evolving. But no, they're still finches, not changing into a different kind of a bird. And then they don't account for the fact that, well, what happens when it rained again, when the drought disappeared? Well, the guys with the shorter beaks could also survive. So that changes the whole picture. So that's not a good example of evolution. Peppered moths, same thing. Insects developing resistance to pesticides. Yeah, they change. They can adapt to their environment. Some become resistant to certain pesticides. But, you know, the insect isn't evolving. Yeah, it adapted to its environment, but it's still an insect. It hasn't changed. So all observed changes involve sorting and loss of genetic information. Fruit flies. This is an experiment that was run in the lab by scientists. Why fruit flies? Well, because fruit flies propagate very quickly. You know, from one generation to the next, it goes very quickly. They can do thousands of generations. I mean, you can't do that with animals or with human beings. You know, we don't live through a number of generations of human beings, and so we can't see that happening. But if you run the experiment, radiate some fruit flies, you know, cause mutations and cause them to propagate, you know, to the next generation, you think you should see some big changes in those fruit flies. Well, you get fruit flies with extra wings or no wings or huge wings or, you know, double wings like is shown here. But they're not very useful fruit flies. In fact, they can't even propagate themselves after a certain number of generations if they're mutated too badly. And yet the results are still fruit flies. They haven't changed into any other species. So there's no progressive beneficial changes from simple to complex. There's no increase in quantity or the quality of the genetic information that makes up the fruit flies. They just don't change, except for the bad. I mean, most mutations are bad. So I use some quotes, and most of these quotes are from evolutionists, because evolutionists realize at this point that they have a real problem explaining how evolution works. Here's one, Roger Lewin, at a conference in Chicago, said, the central question of the conference was whether the mechanisms underlying microevolution can be extrapolated to explain the phenomena of macroevolution. At the risk of doing violence to the positions of some of the people at the meeting, the answer can be given as a clear no. This is from an evolutionist. He understands they have a problem. They can't explain how that could happen. Here's another one. This is written by an Israeli scientist, and he's not a believer, but he wrote a book where he studied mutations and natural selection, and he came to the conclusion that there's no chance that that can work. It just cannot work because of information that just, you can't add the information to get to a more complex living mechanism. Random, chance, mutation, natural selection are opposites. They just don't work. There's a conference that happened in 2009, which I don't cover in my talk here, but where evolutionists got together, the leading evolutionists in the world, 16 of them got together in Austria, and sort of a secret meeting, but it was recorded and written in a book called the Altenberg 16. And they admit very clearly they don't have the answer. Darwinian evolution does not work. Science cannot explain how that might work. Part of this same author here, Spettner, if at the end there, if mutations are non-random and or the environment can stimulate adaptive mutations, the paradigm of Darwinian evolution, which has been around for 150 plus years, must be replaced. It just doesn't work. And so he's come to the conclusion that, yes, they adapt to their environment, and that's what we say too. As Christians and as we read the Bible, we look at chapter 1 of Genesis, and it says, God created everything according to its kind and reproduced it according to their kind. And he said that 10 times, so 10 different kinds. Mankind being a special kind, and there's changes in the environment cause changes in the kind, but a dog is still a dog. May have started from a wolf, but it's still part of the dog family. So here's another one who admit that that doesn't work. Here, Dr. Jerry Bergman, who is a creationist, he looked at Darwinism and the deterioration of the genome. I mean, the human genome is very complex. We have 3 billion base pairs in our DNA in the body, and about 25,000 or so different kinds of genes. And he said, it requires information, all of this description of the living organism, but if you look at the living organism, it's degrading. Yes, we're getting mutations. We have cancer. We have other diseases. Some of the cells are degenerating in our body, and that's all due to the degradation of the information in the genome, and that's totally counter what Darwinism would predict. There is no good example of a beneficial information-gaining mutation. Very few mutations are beneficial, 0.01% is measured. Thousands of mutations exist, and now, although don't cover the details here, each human being probably has about 100 different mutations in their generation. And so it's getting gradually worse and worse. And this professor here, John Sanford, who was a professor at Cornell University in New York, he was a strong believer in evolution. But then when some of his students questioned him, where's your evidence? He realized he didn't have the evidence. He just believed what his professors told him over the years. And so he started to question the primary action of Darwinian evolution and determine that we are the result of random genetic mutations and natural selection. That is the primary axiom. An axiom is untestable, yet is accepted as absolute truth. It's assumed to be true. Can't be proven to be true, but it's assumed to be true by evolutionists. And he found most mutations are harmful, for example, cancer. Random mutations destroy information. It doesn't add information, just destroys it. Selection can't eliminate all bad mutations, and good mutations are mostly unselectable. And this graph shows that. I'm not going to go into the details here. But by the way, all of these slides I'm using here are up on my website. I'll be uploading them after the talk. And so don't worry about taking copious notes. You can get the details there and references to where I get this information from. So most mutations are neutral or bad. The chance of selection of good mutations is essentially zero. It's very hard to do. And he agrees totally with Spettner, who is not a believer. John Sanford here is a believer. He used to be a non-believer, but looking at the evidence in creation for the support or lack of support for evolution, he became a creationist. And he has also made sense of the, why people were able to live longer before the flood than they can now. And he's come up with this curve, you see here, that explains that pretty well over the number of generations that man has lived on Earth. And he's come to the conclusion that the primary axiom is impossible. And then fourth, we come to this gal here, Lynn Margulis, who is has a doctorate in biology, and she came up with a article in American Scientist 2006 saying these things. Many biologists claim they know for sure that random mutation, purposeless, there's no purpose in it, it just mutates, it's just by chance, is the source of inherited variation that generates new species of life. As a biologist, she says no. It just cannot happen, cannot be explained. New mutations don't create new species, they create offspring that are impaired. Again, agreeing that the offspring are inferior to what they started with. So in summary then, you have these four scientists with PhD degrees. They all agree that Darwinian evolution cannot be explained by what Darwin says they could be explained by. And that is random mutations and natural selection. What does happen is that the species do adapt to the environment that they're put in. And so adaptive, not random mutations. They're mutations that respond to the environment. They just don't happen randomly. They're controlled by built-in cellular processes. They lead to limited genetic and phenotypic changes. Adaptive mutation is not a mechanism for evolution, but for adaptation. So yes, it explains microevolution, but it cannot explain macroevolution, because macroevolution requires the production of new information to get to a more complex living organism. Mutations can't provide the source of genetic information need for selection. So we see mutational deterioration of the genome. And all four of them agree on that. Two of these scientists are creationists, and two of them believe in evolution. And yet they're all looking at the same evidence, but they make different assumptions and therefore come to different conclusions. Okay, so second is, transitional fossils. You may, and I'm sure not many of you have read Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, which describes the origin of nothing, because there's no example of any species that has evolved. He just assumes it's true. But he was an honest scientist in that he said he devoted a whole chapter to possible problems with his theory of evolution. And one of the things he said, I don't have the fossil evidence to prove that evolution is true. However, I believe over the years, scientists will find such evidence. Well, it's now 150 plus years later. What have we found? Well, I'm going to go through the highlights of some of the things which show that we haven't found what Darwin was looking for. First of all, inverted fossil orders. I mean, if Darwin's theory is true, you'd expect to have very simple living organisms on the bottom geological layers, and then the next layers up be more and more complex. Well, we don't have that. We have seashells, which are on the top of Mount Everest. They should be at the bottom layers. How'd they get up there? Darwinian evolution can't explain that. I'm going to talk briefly about the Cambrian Explosion and yeah, these other ones here. Let me just go right to them. Cambrian Explosion. These layers are layers that secular scientists put together, assuming that evolution is true, and assuming that the age of the fossils in those different layers are the years listed here. These here, these are not biblical order, but these are secular guesses at when those layers were put down and what living organism would be at each layer. You should find very simple ones in the Cambrian and more simple, single cellular living organisms there. What do we find? Well, the Cambrian layer contains fossils of most phyla known to man today in this layer. The animals, for example, the different kinds of animals we have today, most of the phyla for those are in the bottom layer. That shouldn't be. Only soft-bodied organisms like worms found in the Precambrian strata. So how did they get from the Precambrian to the Cambrian? There's no evidence for that. In fact, Stephen Meyer, who you heard in this video, wrote a book on that. He called it Darwin's Doubt. Darwin doubted because he knew about the Cambrian explosion. He knew that there was doubt that his theory may not be true if they can't find better evidence. So Stephen Meyer wrote a very good book on that. The number of species fossilized in higher layers decreases in each higher layer. Scientists determine that. Well, if evolution is working, you'd expect to see more and more kinds of living organisms and much more complex ones. Well, you don't see that in the record. So here is a textbook writer for high school and college, Futum, evolutionary biology. He says there, it is considered likely that all the animal phyla became distinct, not extinct, distinct before or during the Cambrian explosion layer, for they all appear fully formed without intermediates connecting one phylum to another. So he knows that the evidence is not in those layers. Okay. Next, I want to talk about living fossils. I'm sure many of you haven't heard these before or read them in your textbook, but some of these, like the coelacanth fish, scientists have, I think back in the until 1938 or so, they didn't believe that there were any coelacanth fish alive anymore. They believed that that species died out totally. And they have some fossils of that fish, like there's one there. Well then, guess what? Some fisherman off the coast of Africa caught a live fish, and he looked at the fossil structure, and it was almost exactly the same as this here. Well, 70 million years, and there's no change? That fish didn't evolve very well, didn't follow instructions. So, and then we have another example is the termite. Darwin predicted that fossils would show changes in the fossil record over the years. So we would have expected to see changes in the coelacanth fish structure. We would have expected to see changes in termites. Well, the termites you have in your house today, the leftover of that, hopefully, their fossils look much the same. as old, supposedly old fossils in lower layers of the geological layer. So these are what we refer to as living fossils. I just give you two examples, but there's many more. And then we have polystrate fossils. Well, these polystrate, that means they go across multiple strata of geological columns. Okay, so because you know trees, well, some of them can live a few hundred years, I suppose, but you don't expect many trees to live that long. And if you look at what's left over from most trees, well, they're either used for firewood or they've been destroyed by the environment or what have you. Well, what do you do when you see something like this, which clearly is a fossil of a tree going through multiple geological layers? How can that be? If those layers require millions of years, to fill in slowly according to evolution, how do you make those two things, agree? You can't until you take a tour of Mount St. Helens and you look at some of these tree stumps standing up in the water. And if you go to Mount St. Helens, and this is a good reason to go to on one of these Mount St. Helens tours, because they'll explain all that. But there are layers geological in the columns there that are hundreds of feet tall, and those layers were formed in a matter of days or weeks or months, some of them. One I believe is as thick as 600 feet, over a few months. And so you see that you can get the leftover of the trees covered by these columns in the geology layers there. And that explains what we have there. And these fossils are best explained by Noah's flood, because that was a catastrophic event. The whole earth moved, all the layers moved, and covered these fossils very quickly. And that's the only way the fossils can be preserved, after all. They have to be covered quickly. I mean, if a fish that dies and you put them on the beach, the vultures will get them very quickly, and there's no fossil left at all. These have to be formed very, very quickly. And then we come to hominid fossils, fossils for humans. Some of these names you have heard about, and probably some of them are still in your textbooks. Neanderthal man, fossils found in 1856 in various parts of Europe. Java man turns out to be a hoax, an artificial construct. Piltdown man, proven to be a hoax. Nebraska man, based on the tooth of an extinct pig. And then we have Ramapithecus, based on this orangutan, back in 1930. Some of those, and Lucy, the final one I'm going to cover here, all of these have been in your textbooks, your science textbooks. And they said, well, this is evidence that evolution really works. Because look, these fossils prove it. But all they have is a snapshot of one fossil. They don't have all the in-between showing that might have evolved. Lucy, and I'm just going to cover this one here, was thought to be a very credible example of that, because they found actually 40% of the skeleton, 40% of the bones of the skeleton. Note that they did not find any feet. They did not find a complete knee bone. They did not find a pelvic bone that explained walking upright. So they didn't find all the pieces there. But they surmised that it was a good show of evolution because the ratio of the arm and the leg was sort of halfway in between that of a human being and an ape-like creature. So if this is sort of halfway in between, well, that must be a good example of evolution. What they don't tell you is some of these bones here were not found on the same site. They're actually found a few hundred miles away in a different layer of rock and put together based on their assumption that evolution is true. They didn't have the evidence. They assumed it was true and then put the story together to make it look like it was true. So they reconstructed Lucy based on their assumption that he was an example, or she was an example of a transitional fossil. Well, they didn't take into account the fact that the leg bones were broken in two places, and one end was crushed. So that ratio I showed you of 83.9%, that's not real. It's a different ratio. The pelvis hip was incomplete, and they actually reshaped it to make it look like it could have walked upright. They don't have the evidence that it could walk upright. They just assumed it could. The knee joint was found over, well, I say over 1 mile, but actually some of these were found much further away and in different layers in the strata. So the fossil remains of two different creatures fitted to form a make-believe creature. Okay, then how did they reconstruct it? I mean, if you look at the St. Louis Museum, you'll see, hey, this is Lucy. This proves that evolution is true. Well, here's what they found, bones. How did they determine how much hair was in that fossil? Hair is not preserved. And you'll notice that the fossil sample there has, well, less hair than you'd expect on an ape. And it has more hair than some of you have on your heads. So it must be in between. You know, that shows evolution is true. Notice that this creature here is showing a very pensive mood there. How do they know we look like that? Well, they assume that evolution is true, and they put some human-like features in there. And then another thing that got me was the look at the feet. Well, where's the feet bones? There are none. So how did they get feet that look like that? Well, if it was sort of halfway between a human and an ape-like creature, it must have had feet like a human being. So that's how the artist drew it. So this is an artist's conception of a transitional fossil if evolution were true. This doesn't prove evolution. It's just they assumed it's true, and therefore they show something that is not real. And so this is what your children, grandchildren, are being taught in school. You know, Lucy is in there in those books still. So the pelvis, I said, you know, was worked on to make it look like it could be. So they actually, there's a video clip on the web which shows them fixing the pelvis, and the scientist doing that, explaining what he's doing and why he's doing it. And so it's not real. 40% of the skeleton, you know, nothing in the museum here mirrors what is found in the evidence. It just assumed that it's true. Okay, so I'm going to jump past a bunch of these. This is probably one of the best, and I know it's kind of hard to read. You can see it on my website, and I've got some other ones which show similar pictures, but and this is actually hard to find on the internet anymore because they realize the story that this picture is telling you, and they don't want that story to get out there. What that's showing is, and both of these are supposedly evolutionary trees, you know, going from a single cell here and here, and then branching out, okay, into different kinds of living organisms, and here too, just a different showing, okay, and this is, you know, what we see today. These are the animals, some of the animals we see today. Well, notice some of these lines are solid lines. Other lines are dotted lines. And what that means is the ones that are solid lines, they have evidence. There is evidence. Remember the coelacanth fish? You know, the fossil looks the same now as it did on the fossil. It looks the same. And if you dig down, you know, you're going to find evidence that a coelacanth fish, you know, changes into another coelacanth fish. So that's the solid lines, but then below a certain level, they have no evidence. They have nothing in the Cambrian, nothing in the Precambrian, and so these dotted lines show how things, quote, might have evolved, might have. It doesn't show real evidence. It just might have happened. And if evolution is true, there must be evidence here too, but they don't have any. And they don't even have branching out of these fossils here. Okay, they are all different. They're all different. There is no branching between them. And that's a very important picture, because that shows that the fossil record does not support evolution. Darwin admitted when he wrote the book Origin of Species, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. He knew in 1859 that he didn't have the evidence. He knew the complexity of the human eye, and he had no explanation of that. There's no way he could explain it. And like I said, he devoted a whole chapter of his book to possible problems with his theory. And it said, but eventually scientists will find out and show this to be true. Well, we have not found that out. So another, Paul Moody wrote in a standard textbook, so far as we can judge from the geological record, large changes seem usually to have arisen suddenly. Fossil forms intermediate between large subdivisions of classification, such as orders and classes, are seldom found. Well, read that, never. They're never found. They just hope to find them, what Darwin needed to prove his theory, but they can't. And Colin Patterson, a British Museum paleontologist, wrote, or quoted this, he said, I fully agree with your comment on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one might make a watertight argument. None. He hasn't found any. This is a paleontologist working in the British Museum for years and years, and he hasn't come across that. Okay, the third one I want to cover is life did not originate from non-life by random chance. And for evolution to be true, I mean, you've got to have life starting someplace. And if it's not by creation, it must have started by some living cell and evolved into the complexity that we see today. Well, scientists have run experiments going back to 1688. These four scientists have shown that it is, they show no evidence that living material can come from non-living material. The law of biogenesis, that is, life comes from life, has never been falsified. It always needs a beginning life. Non-complex life form is impossible. Because if you look at simple life forms, they're way too complex to just form by chance. Mycoplasma, for example, simplest self-reproducing organisms, 482 genes, 580,000 letters. It requires parasitizing a more complex organism. And the parasites result from loss of genetic information, loss, not the gain or using new information. How simple can life be? Well, here's that structure. And you have to remember, you can forgive Darwin because he didn't know what the cell structure looked like. He just thought it was a blob. No problem for duplicating that. So he didn't know about the complexity of the cell. But we now know through electronic telescopes, microscopes, that there are 580,000 DNA-based pairs or letters in the simplest living bacteria. The human genome, we have 3 billion base pairs. So we are at least a few thousand orders or times the complexity of a small bacteria. Why do we come to different answers? Well, here is basically how we come to that. First of all, evolution presupposition. It says the universe consists of only two material things, mass and energy. You know of Einstein's equation, E equal mc squared. You can convert energy into mass. You can convert mass into energy, back and forth, but you can't create new mass and new energy. The creation presupposition, and they would not take any supernatural or spiritual or information presupposition into consideration. Creation, however, we presuppose that there's something else, that there's information. There's another entity, another dimension, and that is information. Information, in the case of our bodies, is encoded with the DNA, RNA, of all the plant and animal cells. So life consists of material and non-material information. The evolutionists will say, well, everything can be explained in terms of mass and energy. I mean, you've got brain waves here in your brain, and they can change. You know, that's information. Well, where did that information come from? And what if you are an evolutionist and you spout off some statement, and why should I believe it if it's just a random statement? I mean, it's not even logical. So information is encoded in our DNA. Life is material and non-material information. Information has the following 4 components. Code, those 4. Let me just go to that slide here. You know, when you write a sentence, for example, you depend on characters of an alphabet. In our case, 26 characters in the English alphabet and numbers. And you can combine them into words, and then you can combine those words into sentences, and then that sentence consists of some action, as a verb in it, as a noun in it, and there's a purpose. You do the same thing with information in biological systems. You know, you have the DNA, which consists of these 4 letters, and put them in certain orders. They come up with words that represent one of the 20 possible amino acids that are necessary for protein formation. And I'm not going to go into the detail of this, but just to say that there are thousands of different kinds of amino acids, and only 20 left-handed amino acids make up living material. All the rest they're not living. You can't make a living protein out of it. You can just use those 20. The action, proteins are needed for constructions, for function. I mean, we can't live without proteins, obviously. And it involves reproduction of the organisms and its cellular components. Purpose, reproduction of life. Very similar to writing a story, writing an article. You've got the characters, you've got the words, you've got a sentence, and you've got meaning and purpose to it. Same thing with the information in our DNA. The complexity of the cell. I mean, this just shows part of it, but it's so complex. You can't even explain one cell. You know, for all the pieces to come together randomly to produce a living cell, it's impossible to explain mathematically. And so if you look at a mathematical probability, I mean, you've all tried to flip coins and come up, you know, how many have succeeded in putting 10 dimes coming up heads in a row? You know, they're not leaded, they're not, you know, your standard coins. You can't cheat. And so, but how many times does it take? As you get more and more, you know, like 100 heads in a row or 1,000 heads in a row, you'll see it's impossible. It takes a number that is like 10 to the power of 300 times throwing that dime to get just 100 or 1,000 heads in a row. It's not going to happen. And why won't it happen? Well, look at this here. A single protein that consists of 400 amino acids in a specific row, the probability of forming that is 1 in 10 to the power of 240. A single cell, that cell that I showed, or that you see here, the probability of forming that is 1 in 10 to the power of 40,000. We're getting some very, very small numbers here. Spontaneous formation of life is just not going to happen by chance. Atoms in the universe, there's only 10 to the power of 80 atoms in the universe. There's only so many ways you can arrange them. And mathematicians agree that the law of probability says that if anything is required to be less than 1 in 10 to the power of 50, it's not going to happen. It's not that it probably won't happen, it just will not happen. Mathematicians agree. The numbers I showed here are so small, you know, 1 in 10 to the power of 40,000, it just can't happen. by chance, just mathematically. It cannot happen. So, and these scientists agree, 40,000 knots after, big enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. I mean, it just can't happen. You can't explain it, bar Darwinian evolution. Okay, I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. The fourth one I want to cover briefly is evolution and the second law of thermodynamics. Does the second law of thermodynamics agree with evolution? Well, look at it. Second law of thermodynamics says you have increasing entropy. In other words, increasing energy that is unusable. Everything that you have deteriorates over time. And so we're losing stuff. Order goes from, things go from order to disorder. I mean, even if you have a clean bedroom and you don't enter it, it still becomes more disorderly over time, all by itself, or dust falls, or things happen. It gets disorderly. Evolution, if we really got here by the Big Bang, it requires going from disorder, in other words, an explosion. First there was nothing, and then it exploded. Okay, explain that one first of all. By science, you can't. And then an explosion causes order? I don't think so. I've never seen that happen. And so here you have what has happened in evolution, and it's totally against the law of thermodynamics. So what do we observe in nature? We observe order going to disorder. We have less available energy over time, and there's increased randomness over time. And that agrees with the second law of thermodynamics. So it's totally against the theory of evolution. And just a few slides on that. Classical thermodynamics, I said energy can be converted to work, energy can be converted to mass can be converted to energy. And there's different kinds of entropy, which we don't have time to go into it here. But the point is, there's no known exceptions to the second law of thermodynamics. Scientists have not found any exceptions to that. Even the atheist evolutionist Isaac Asimov says, another way of stating the second law then is the universe is constantly getting more disorderly. And we agree, everything is getting more disorderly. Even if you try and clean things up, it's still, things deteriorate. And so you apply that to cosmic, which is the beginning of the universe, chemical evolution, and biological evolution, and you'll see that they just don't match. You can't go from chaos and disorder to a more complex universe. You're just not going to get there by random chance. So evolutionists will say, well, the second law only applies to a closed system. Living systems are exceptions because they represent open systems. Solar energy is added to the earth. I mean, solar energy from the sun comes to the earth, and that supplies the energy, and it's an open system. Well, yes, it is added to the earth, but it's not an open versus closed system issue. The second law applies to the whole universe. Entropy is increasing. Things become less organized, less complex, more random in the universe. And we can see that. Evidence is all over. Raw solar energy increases entropy, that is heat. I mean, I can put a piece of iron outside there and the sun shines, the iron is not going to change into something nice. It's going to rust, right? It's going to deteriorate. There's less and less of the iron left after a while. And so that's consistent with what we see in the second law, but that's inconsistent with the evolution. So here's another, and this Dr. John Ross is an evolutionist, but even he says there are no known violations of the second law of thermodynamics. The second law applies equally to open systems as well. So then we look, well, what are we talking about? If the sun shines on a piece of iron, it's going to turn to rust. How is it going to get more organized complexity out of what we have there? So when you have the sun as a source, That's the energy supply. What else do we need to make it work in living organisms, for example? It requires a program. There has to be a program. You know, think of the human body. Yes, we start from one cell. That one cell divides into 2 and into 4 and into 8, 16, etc. And they're all identical, all identical. But you know, we have 200 different kinds of cells in our bodies. How did they become different? When did they start to become different? Who programmed them to become different at the right time? You know, the cell divides and divides until a certain stage, all the same, and then all of a sudden they become different kinds of cells. Bone cells, skin cells, eye cells, you know, nail cells, what have you. 200 different kinds, kidney cells, all different kinds of organs. Who wrote the program that causes that to happen just at the right time? Because if it didn't happen at the right time, we wouldn't be here. Okay, it's as simple as that. And then there needs to be a mechanism for storing and converting the incoming energy. I mean, you just can't have the sun shining on some organism and, you know, things happen. No. Think of plants. The photosynthesis process, the sun's energy turns it into proteins. There has to be a program in the living plant, and there has to be a way of storing, capturing the energy and turning it into something that can grow proteins. There has to be a program to turn it into proteins. A seed can turn it into a plant. Well, how does it do that? There has to be a program to do that. Animal metabolism, energy has to be turned into, you know, the diet, working on the diet in your body to feed your body. All those things are examples where there's information and there's a program involved in making things happen. So living systems have a program, and that's in our DNA. The DNA is not just that code that I showed, but it's also the programs that code can produce and direct the process of building organisms. The process continues throughout the life of the organism faster than natural processes can break it down. So it can go beyond the second law, for example. And living systems must have a storage conversion mechanism, as I showed there. Okay, so that's, so in summary then, evolution is only a theory. It has not been proven. You can't prove evolution. Darwinian evolution, we don't have enough time to see all those changes that would have to happen to make evolution work. It's a continuous, naturalistic, mechanistic process by which all living things have arisen from a single living source, which itself arose by a similar process from a non-living, inanimate world. A theory, if you have a real theory that works, it implies that it's self-consistent. It must agree with observations, and it must be useful. How does evolution rack up against that? Well, it's not self-consistent. Remember when I showed the 5 different definitions that people use for evolution? They're not consistent with each other. So they're trying to wave their hands in some way to make you think that evolution is true. So, but evolution requires multiple definition. In the varied and contradictory camps connected with thermodynamics, you saw phylogeny, which is the structure of living organisms, proposed mechanisms, and various subtheories. They just don't pass muster. There is no evidence which shows that that is true. Evolution does not agree with observations. I covered the fossil record. We talked about genetics. We talked about molecular biology and thermodynamics and probability mathematics. We didn't have time to cover all the other ones, but I can assure you they do not agree with the theory of evolution, or the theory of evolution doesn't agree, you know, with what we see in these different areas, disciplines of science. And evolution is not proven useful. There's no new advancements in scientific knowledge or technology. Science does not require a belief in evolution. Some would, in the secular world, will say, well, if you're a creationist, you're a creation scientist, how can we believe you? You're not a real scientist, is what they'll say. Well, I would submit you don't have to believe in evolution to be a good scientist. In fact, if you look at the foundations of our science disciplines, you'll see that almost all of those founders of the different disciplines of science were Bible-believing scientists. They believed in the truth of the Scripture. And probably the best example of that is Isaac Newton. People see him as one of the greatest scientists ever. And yet he believed the Bible, he believed God, and those scientists, were looking for what God gave us and tried to understand it. And we as scientists are free to do that. In fact, we're encouraged to do that. And but what people don't know about Isaac Newton is, as much as he discovered science, he wrote more words as commentary on the books of the Bible than he wrote on science. So an example of a scientist who is a Christian and founded many disciplines of science. There are no advancements in medicine. In fact, some advances in medicine were hindered because of false claims by evolutionists. You might remember that the scientists said that, well, all the vestigial organs that you have, like your appendix or your tonsil, I think there's almost 100 different organs in our bodies that evolution said, no, it's all left over from remnants of evolution, all left over. Well, now they know there was a purpose for all of those organs. The appendix, for example, it's part of our immune system. Yeah, we can live without it, but it helps our immune system. Some of you have lost an appendix or a tonsil or some other organ, but you can still live without it. It just, your immune system is not as strong as it could be. And then I don't have it here, but the DNA, only 2% of our DNA is coded for proteins, living material. And the scientists have said up till about 2009, all the rest of that DNA, that's junk DNA. Serves no purpose. It's all left over from evolution. Well, now we know, scientists know, that the rest of that DNA is very useful. It's used to turn things on and off in our body and to communicate with different parts of the body. All of it serves a purpose. It's not left over from evolution. It serves a purpose. So there are false claims made by evolutionists that have held science back, is what I'm saying. So there's no positive contribution to society through evolution-based social sciences. In fact, there's some very bad consequences of that. And when Bruce Barton comes to speak here in August, he will talk about that, some of the bad consequences. So evolution cannot be proven. It operates too slowly to be measurable. We can't use a scientific method to measure it. Small variations in organisms observed today are not relevant because they can't be used to distinguish between evolution and creation. We as creation scientists, we believe in those adaptations to the environment. We see them happening, and they're real, but we can account for them. But these two scientists here, who are clearly evolutionists, have said, like Nilsson here, my attempt to demonstrate evolution by an equipment carried on for more than experiment for more than 40 years has completely failed. 40 years trying to look for evidence, and he can't find it. So evolution is found wanting. Evolution has never been observed. That's the macroevolution, Darwinian evolution. There are no credible transitional fossils. Life cannot, did not, and will not originate from non-life by chance. And evolution actually violates the second law of thermodynamics. So with that, I'm going to bring it to a conclusion. And if you remember the cartoon in front, you'll understand why this cartoon is there too. He said, well, my wife left me for a prince, said she'd kissed enough of mankind. So, and that goes back to the cartoon up front, and you'll understand it. Well, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Heinz. I'm going to have the opportunity to lead the discussion today, but just as we lead into that, we're going to have an opportunity for a free will offering tonight. And I'll just remind you, many of you are aware that the free will offering is primarily used for honorariums for our speakers, though that won't pertain to Dr. Lycklama tonight. So we appreciate your just helping facilitate the Apologetics Forum continuing on. Our resources are brought not only from the free will offering, but also from the book table sales. So with that, we're going to give the opportunity for the next minutes if there are any questions, and I can bring the microphone to you, and Heinz is still wired to give responses if you have those questions. Anyone?
I noticed that Lucy had human-looking eyes, and I just saw a film that mentioned Lucy, and I thought maybe you could talk about that just a little bit.
Which film was that? On a secular
No,
view?
no, on a Christian.
Okay.
Yeah, Paul Taylor, actually. And
Okay.
he talked about the eyes, and
Yeah.
and when the artists do the eyes, they look like human-looking eyes
Yeah.
because they have the whites of the eyes.
Mm-hmm.
But then gorillas and such, apes do not have the whites. They have
Yeah.
black eyes.
Yeah.
So that's a rendition from the artists.
Yeah, well, that goes to all the things that have been modified in the museum. They portray a picture that looks halfway in between an ape and a human, and so they have to come up with something. I'm sure it doesn't look exactly like a human eye. I mean, the artist would draw it somewhere in between the two, and like with the amount of hair, they have no way of measuring it because hair is not preserved in a fossil. So they have to guess at it because they assume evolution is true. And so they draw something that makes you think evolution is true.
Someone else?
A quick question. When was Lucy born? How many millions of years was it?
Well, it depends which parts of Lucy you're talking about.
Any part.
Yeah, well, I think they're thinking between 2 and 3 million secular
So
scientists.
here's my comment.
Sorry?
Where are all the rest of the human beings that have died since? Where are the bones?
Yeah, well, they have found other fossils, which they claim are other intermediates. I mean, you can look at some of those, pictures which map the different human fossils, but it's guesswork. It depends on which layer of the geology they found the fossil in the first place.
Then I have another comment. I'm a Norwegian of origin, and in the north part of Norway, there's an island halfway up towards the North Pole. It's called the Svalbard Islands, and there are massive coal reserves in that island. And they've been digging for coal there for years. And back in the 50s, they were about 500 feet down in the ground, and they found a petrified palm trees with coconuts on them.
Oh, yeah.
Just for your information. It's interesting because it is almost at the North Pole.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's not unfamiliar. I mean, there's other finds at the deeper layers which they're surprised at, and that's just one of them.
There was another hand. Question?
So before your presentation, you qualified it by telling us your experience, your expertise.
Yeah.
What expertise does Darwin have?
He trained.
He was
Well, by going on the trip, mostly. He had some training in naturalism, but he started out training as a pastor. Yeah. And it turns out, you'd be surprised how many people start out training to be a pastor, minister of the word, and then went off in different directions. I mean, Marx and other people like that as well.
Additional questions? Yes.
I just had a general comment or thought when you were talking about the usefulness of the evolution as a theory, and I was sort of thinking about Einstein's comment about relativity, and he said, he was more, in some sense more honest, said, no number of experiments could prove my theory correct, and only one could prove it false.
Correct. Yeah.
So we're kind of in a situation, if you listed for usefulness or however the theory of relativity and compared it to evolution, there'd be dramatic differences.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's helpful for people who are trying to rationalize this and understand it, who are not, whether they're believers or not, just trying to intellectually understand what's going on. And the other concern I have is that if you're a student and you go to college today and you start talking the way with the ideas that you're exposing to, you'll probably flunk your biology class and maybe get kicked out of school. So there's a real sinister aspect going on that at some level is very scary, because academic departments are no longer institutions of free inquiry, they're dogma. And I see it, I have grandchildren too. I'm sure you worry about your grandchildren, how they're going to get educating it through school. So could you comment on how that relates to your children or your grandchildren's generation and where this is all headed?
Yeah, it's a concern that we all have, you know, for our children and our grandchildren. And of course, that's one of the reasons why I do this, because fortunately I've had the background of a scientist and of a Bible teacher, and so I know what the issues are, and I feel it's my duty to impart that knowledge to our children and grandchildren. There happen to be a row up front here, my interested children and grandchildren who are you know, listening, but they've benefited from that, because you know, they get persecuted in school too. They get docked. Their grades will be lower if they come up with an answer that the teacher doesn't want. You know, I don't know if you saw the video that we showed last month, you know, in a classroom where the teacher taught evolution, and he said, you know, I know you students don't believe in evolution, but you know, we have evidence and you have no evidence. But it turns out when the students asked him the questions, show us the evidence, he couldn't answer them. So the teachers only teach what they themselves have been taught, and they don't know what really is true. And I've seen that too in some of my lectures. In fact, I gave a lecture like this in Bulgaria a number of years ago to a secular audience in a university, and there's one man in the audience he's a retired biology teacher, and I spoke against evolution, giving many of the same reasons here and a few others, and he listened very intently, and he said, you know, he said to some of his colleagues, you know, I'm sorry I taught all these students these errors, and he asked me, if you come again, can I take you to my city where my students now are, because they are teachers themselves and they're teaching evolution. And so I got the opportunity to give a lecture in those schools without mentioning the Bible, because you can't do that. But when I got through, they asked the right questions. They said, well, I know you don't believe in evolution, so how do you believe we got here? And so that opens the discussion. You know, once they ask, you can go down that road.
Time for a closing question.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Otherwise, I'll turn things over back to Heinz, who wants to introduce the next month's session.
Yeah. Okay, so just to wrap things up, I covered just 4 science reasons why evolution is not good science. And I mentioned that book called Exploring Evolution, written by a local author here, and he actually lists 77 different reasons. You know, if you put up that last slide there on the presentation, 77 scientific reasons why evolution is not good science. And that I found very useful he himself is not a deep scientist, but he points to the science experts in their fields and said, here's why these 77 reasons are not good arguments for evolution. And so you might want to look at that book there. And there's a bunch of other books too. I find that the best apologists are those that used to believe in evolution and now believe in creation, because a student challenged them and said, so what's the evidence for evolution? Well, he couldn't answer that. He had to go investigate. John Sanford, one of the key creation scientists here, he wrote a book refuting evolution, but he used to believe in evolution. He's one of the best apologists because he understands both sides of that argument. My lecture here gave you just 4 specifics a little deeper on, but these are the 4 biggies that I consider are hampering our kids' belief systems. Next month we have Vince LaPointe speaking, and he's going to answer the question, can you believe the Bible? And if you read what he's got on his flyer on the event description, you'll see that he didn't grow up in a Christian family, but he came to believe because once he examined the evidence, he said, yep, the Bible really is true. And he's going to give these 5 reasons why he believes the Bible is true. And so that's tied in with what I covered here today. He'll talk a little bit about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so he's and then the month after we have Bruce Barton speaking on the consequence of bad ideas, believing that evolution is true, and the consequences of that are very important to know as well. Okay, so those are the next speakers, and I mentioned as well, and I've sent out an email to some church leaders saying we have Shahram Hadian, who is an ex-Muslim, is now a Christian pastor, and he's going to be here in September. He's going to speak at our forum on the Bible versus the Quran, and he's also going to put on a conference on a Saturday morning after that. And then he's also available to speak on a Thursday night at a different venue. So if you represent different churches here, you might want to contact me and see if he might be available for an event that you have planned. So on the back table there are flyers for the next event. Pick one up if you want to find out more about that. Of course, go to the website and get all the information, what's coming up. Take a flyer with you, post it in your church foyer if you're allowed to do that, or give it to your leaders and have them do that for you. Remember that the creation tours are coming up starting in July. Ron Payne, see him. He'll be at the CAPS book table, and there's flyers on that event, on the creation tours as well, on the table back there. Get more information there. Ron also has a bunch of special DVDs that go along with those tours as well, covering Mount St. Helens and covering the Missoula flood in eastern Washington. So you might want to look at those. And he's got a bunch of DVDs, things like God of Wonders and a bunch of other ones which are available for $2 each. And the caveat is, if you take them, give them out to colleagues that you want to listen to them. Okay, and then the last thing I have back there is the brochure on the Mike Riddle does a training course back in North Carolina in August, 5-day training course. Some of us here are going to that, and to help teach on creation versus evolution and other apologetics topics. So if you have any interest in getting more ammunition on that, take a look at this, and you might have an interest in that. Okay, and there's some other flyers on the back table too. You might just look at and pick up if you have an interest. Okay, well, so with that, I'm going to close in a word of prayer. You'll be dismissed, and there's, of course, refreshments as usual back there, and look at the resource table, see what might interest you. interest you there too. Father, we come to you just to thank you for your time here. We thank you for the information that you have given us from your creation, and that we can use that in the defense of what we believe. We are not without evidence. We have much evidence that you have given us, and we should be using that wisely. Just pray for traveling mercies for everybody going back home, and may they have the opportunity, give them the opportunity to share with what they have learned here with others that they care about. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.